My name is Sarah Markowitz. I'm the team lead of the community engagement team, and I am standing in for Espoir Delmain of the Cumberland Valley Rising Environmental Committee, which is of course leading this meeting or hosting this event. And tonight we are with Dr. Craig Jurgensen. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered belonged to indigenous peoples for centuries before European settlement. Currently, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Lenape, the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Erie, and later the Indian children of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I encourage everyone watching this evening's program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose land you currently inhabit. And without much further ado, I will go ahead and I will turn things over to Dr. Craig Jurgensen, who is here this evening as an expert after serving over 20 years as a neurologist, and also who now currently serves on the Clean Air Board for Central PA. So thank you so much, Dr. Jurgensen, for being with us this evening. I'll go ahead, I'll mute my audio and video. You should be able to share your screen if you would like to, and then I'll join you for the Q&A after. And for those watching, if you have questions for Dr. Jurgensen, please post them in the on the Facebook in the comments, and I'll definitely ask them. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this opportunity to speak and for your introduction. I worked for 40 years as a neurologist, so I have lots of experience and lots of experience living here in central Pennsylvania, which gives me experience enough to talk about our situation here as we know it. I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes just reviewing the history of Earth Day. Tomorrow, in fact, April 22nd, is the 51st anniversary of the beginning of Earth Day, announced as a day of the nation, initially back in 1970 by President Nixon at that time. But just a short story about how this organization, Earth Day, had its beginning. There was an oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, into the ocean, in Pacific, of course. And one of the observers at that time, who was very distraught and energized by that pollutional accident, was a young senator from Wisconsin, whose name is Gaylord Nelson. And Nelson was overwhelmed by this natural, this spoilage problem, and decided to start an action about to how to recognize this and the other potential for other such actions to occur. And he organized a number of student groups and scientists and legislators and sort of common interest people in the country. The word spread around the country. 7 months later, on April 22nd, 1970, was the first nationwide, the first of its kind, Earth Day, thanks to Gaylord Nelson. That was the beginning of it. It really swept the nation, and there was something magical about it because up till that time, no one had thought too much about the environmental hazards of spoilage of the oil and of the water and the air. But it was the beginning, though, of the founding of this legislation, things that resulted from in our national environmental laws. From that first happening, thanks to Gaylord Nelson, the National Environmental Education Act was passed. The OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act, was passed in 1971, a year later after the spill. The Clean Air Act was first passed in 1970. The Clean Water Act as well, the Endangered Species Act. So all these organizations got founded shortly after this recognition of this Earth Day event by Senator Nelson. And it began to be an annual recognition every year after that in the month of April on the 22nd. The 20th anniversary of the Earth Day sort of was their launch into the global realm. And it began with the beginning of what they call globalearthday.org. And that 20th anniversary, there was an Earth Day around the world in 100 different countries. So now it's spread that far. In 1992, the United Nations hosted the first Earth Summit, again, worldly thing, global, in Rio de Janeiro. The 40th anniversary of the Earth Day was in 2010. The theme at that time was "A Billion Acts of Green," was their slogan. And again, it was a worldwide recognition. The 50th anniversary in 2020 was organized through earthday.org and coordinated 100 million people in 192 countries. This year now, the theme, the slogan for this 51st year is called "Restore Our Earth." Again, all this is a process that began thanks to Senator Nelson. And more recently, along with the energy that's going forth, President Biden, of course, in his very first day in office, signed an agreement to go back with the Paris Climate Accord. President Biden has organized tomorrow on Earth Day, the first global climate summit. And you'll see those to that effect when tomorrow's news comes about. It's going to be a virtual event, of course, but the first global climate summit. So they want energy, they want things to happen. And President Biden's promise or his plan is to advance green energy plan in such a way that to cut carbon emissions to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2050. So it's gone worldwide, and good energy is now involving legislation and things which has to be done. And it comes also down to places, little towns like Carlisle in central PA. In effect, every town, every city, every person needs to be involved now with the effects going on towards climate change. And this is why we're happy to participate in this high-level activity going on this week and this weekend in Carlisle. Nelson's motto was for the whole thing was towards nature and towards climate, we need to be decent and respectful. Those two words, I think, go a long ways to represent what he had in mind. So let's talk about the theme. The topic of this subject tonight I talked about was pandemic plus pollution means double trouble. Both of these pandemic and pollution things are airborne functions that we are exposed to because these elements are in the air, pollution elements and infectious elements. So we're all at risk for these kind of things because basically we have a nose. And air spreads and air flows in wonderful ways. And so let's talk about just some definitions first between the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic and an endemic. An epidemic, epi means upon, demos means people. Something happens upon the people. It's usually stressful or disadvantageous or harmful. If it's localized to a certain region, that's called an epidemic in the short term, usually. When it spreads global, it's called a pandemic, of course, and some viruses and some of the infectious microbial things in the past have gone chronic, you might say, and have persisted for many years, at which time they become endemic. The most two typical examples of that, most typical, are smallpox and influenza. Smallpox, when it has existed on our planet for more than 3,000 years. It persisted that long. Influenza, of course, started in 1918, that particular flu, but it has persisted and mutated and still is an ongoing problem for us to deal with each year. In the early days of our common era, what that is now, AD, I would call the common era, there was no evidence, there was no awareness of what's environmental science was about. No one knew anything about climate biology or climate or even medical science in any way. And the term they used to describe the air back then was miasma, M-I-A-S-M-A, miasma. It's a Greek word, founded, first pronounced by a physician back in Greece whose name was Galen. And his idea was that miasma would, and by the way, the translation of the word miasma means pollution. So Galen, and ever since then, we recognize that these toxic substances in our air do represent pollution. At first he called it miasma, but that's all there was. And of course, back in his day, and in the first 1,000, 1,500, almost all 2,000 years of the Common Era, before we had much medical science, that's all we knew. Miasma was the explanation for everything. They think miasma, or toxic air or pollution air, caused everything from cancer to, bad behavior. All kinds of medical diseases were blamed on miasma. It wasn't until 1886 or so that two people came along. One was Louis Pasteur, and the other was Robert Koch, K-O-C-H, who, with the help of a microscope, looked in and they saw microbial organisms. And the era of microbiology was founded. And microbiology then became a better explanation for how infectious diseases spread and how they act. And the idea of miasma sort of went archaic and out of date, to be sure. But there are these inhalational objects, diseases. The big three to talk about from an inhalational standpoint are smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis. The other, in terms of inhaling toxic substances, we're going to talk about soot. Of course, not much was known about soot until the last few hundred years, when we decided what the compositions is of soot. Of course, it's hydrocarbon distillates and things from incomplete explosions and combustion from engines. Now we have the industrial era. So the combination of toxic elements from combustion and microbial organisms makes this now part of our atmosphere. This is what we live with now. Before the Industrial Revolution, they had toxic things which related to probably the most common element back in those days was called methane. We still have methane, of course, but methane is a organic vapor. It's a fossil. It stems from fossil fuel. It works sort of like carbon. Methane was prevalent in the era when agriculture was the main source of people's making money, and in the agricultural era of way time past. But methane results from agricultural flow and agricultural vapors and things that get trapped in the atmosphere. Methane, and we still have it, of course, traps toxins like carbon does. When carbon goes up to the air and stays there, carbon, of course, lasts forever. Methane has a shorter lifespan, but it also tends to create a ceiling under which toxic substances will persist and be trapped. And there you have what that's about. I'm going to tell some stories now about a couple interesting pollution / pandemic episodes in history that have really made terrible history in a way. Starting in the 16th century, Spain had its eyes on Central America. It knew that there was precious metals could be obtained in Central America and South America, gold and silver. And the Spanish people came across the ocean and invaded and put colonies down through Central America, Mexico, Cuba, and then down through South America, country by country, set up colonies and basically took over the mining operation from the Inca and the Aztec Indians. And Spanish said, we can do this better. And they, to help the Spanish people do more production and more melting and smelting and mining, the Spanish people brought along slaves from Africa. Sound familiar? They needed work people, so let's pick up a boatload of slaves from Africa, and come in and take over, which they did month by month from in the 1600s to take over actually and occupy most all of South America. What they did though, when they did the mining was they made such a big production of it that they set up smelting factories across the country, and they of course melted the iron to refine it, and this created great pollutional problem of lead toxins in the air, lead poisoning, you might say, in the air, lead from lead burning. So the other part of the Spanish arrival in Central and South America was they brought along with them in their baggage on their boats a virus called Smallpox virus. That was part of the baggage. The reason that it was okay in the Spanish people when they settled was that many of them had survived smallpox in their earlier time and had become resistant to it, and they were not sick anymore. But when they had certain people did carry the smallpox, and when they came to the Indian country in Central and South America, those people had no experience with this virus, a Variola virus it's called. And so the pandemic hit the Indian people, and over the course of the next 100 years, basically eliminated the Aztec and the Indian populations. 80 to 95% of the populations, of the Indian populations in South America were eliminated because of a combination of the Spanish people bringing their pollution processes, burning and lead in the air, and smallpox. And that explains what happened in South America. That's the first story, as awful as it is. It was considered the world's first industrial toxic disaster. That is because of the smelting and the amalgamation of metal products, gold and silver. And it was disastrous for the Indians, and it created, thousands of populational changes. A similar kind of thing happened in our own country. There were settlers also into the south of our country, in the southwest and along the western coast in California, just along the Pacific. Again, Spanish people came, the same reasons. They wanted the land, they wanted to take over the population, they wanted to take over the Indians' lands, they wanted all the Indians' valuables, and they brought smallpox with them too. And so, as it turned out, it's in retrospect viewed as the effect of the smallpox in their invasion, you might say, or the colonization, was an act of bio-warfare, in effect, because bio-warfare it means biologic substances become a weapon, and they did. The Indians population, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and other tribes were almost completely eliminated mainly because of the illness of smallpox that wiped out just many of these people had not been exposed before to this brand new virus, and so with no pre-existing protection or any kind of immunity that they had formed, why they were the worst vulnerable people and victims, you might say. So that happened. Another, that's just, I can't say enough about, I realize how about the Indians' downfall had lots to do with many of these kind of colonialization efforts. But again, it was a combination of pandemic and pollution, here again, that was the worst. An interesting story happened in England in the 1665. They were affected by the bubonic plague. That's a bacteria which causes the Black Death, or the pneumonic plague. This certain of it was inhaled through the lungs. And so the city of London lost half its population from bubonic plague in 1665. The people of London said, knowing nothing about how to fix this disease, has some idea that maybe if we create enough smoke will make this bad toxic substance go away. So they had this fumigation program going on whereby they would start fires in the city, and the smoke, they thought, without any science to go by. They had no science. So how would they know? That the smoke would just wipe away all the bad stuff from whatever was happening. Of course, here again, we have the combination in the air of a bacterium, now the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, and smoke and the combustion aspects. And here's the double trouble again, P plus P, pandemic plus pollution. And half the city of London died in 1665. The one interesting happening from this was that, a fellow named William Penn, alive at the time in London, recognized that the only people doing anything to help the sick and the dying in London at that time were the Quakers. So William Penn said, I think I'm a good person. I'm going to join the Quakers. And that what happened after that, of course, when King George found that William Penn had joined the Quaker religion instead of the Church of England, the king said to William, well, you have to leave the country. I'm exiling you, and I'm going to let you go, force you to go to this new land called America, and you go there and stay there and don't come back. William Penn said, okay, I'll do it. And so he did that in 1682. William Penn came here, I think largely because of the effect, again, of the pandemic, the bubonic plague, and the pollution. By the way, on that fire burning thing in London, of course, because they had so many fires to do this fumigation therapy, so-called, the city of London burned down. The fires spread, and the great city in 1666 nearly burned to elimination. So there's that. There's another disaster story that brings it more recently in our time that I want to explain. Happened in 1948 here in Pennsylvania. There's a little town called Donora, a little bit very close to Pittsburgh, where they had steel factories and coal burning operations going on and zinc factories, and the air there was bad in Donora, throughout Pittsburgh, actually. And one day in 1948, they had what we call an inversion. So instead of cold air going up, cold air stayed on the ground, and then the warm air is up here. That is inversion. And what happened was all this emissions from the coal factories and the steel factories and the zinc factory got trapped in this where the people were living. And in 5 days period of time, 100 people in the city of Donora died. And that was a significant percentage of their population. On the 5th day, it rained and the temperature changed and the inversion went away and the air cleared. But the Donora disaster, where you had, again, people who had lived there had pre-existing lung disease because for many, many years they had breathed bad air. So here comes this disaster of this epidemic, you might say, of toxic air. The combination made it a very, very fatal situation. And that led, basically, the good that came from that was that they realized in the country, our country, that we had to do something to protect against this happening again. That started basically the clean air movement in our country, started because of the Donora disaster. And shortly after that, Congress acted. The Clean Air Act was formed shortly after that. The Environmental Protection Agency was formed after that. The Clean, there's a little sign in Donora near Pittsburgh that says, clean air started here because the government got involved. The regulations were written down after that time to protect against this kind of thing happening again. So that's the good thing. What's needed, we need to talk about in all these historical and more recent things is the concept of what we call public health. In the beginning and more recent, there has never been adequate public health to take care of these epidemics when they've come along. It remains a problem. Now today we have the coronavirus, which started in Wuhan, in China, spread very fast because air spreads and people travel. And so that's how this virus got spread so easily around. But back in the old epidemic age, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, there was no concept of public health at all. Not only did that not have any medical science or biologic science to know about, or microbiology, but they had no idea what we could do as a public to protect these things from happening, because it has been and it will continue to be over the years to come. Epidemics and pandemics will continue to happen. As long as there are people breathing close to each other, and viruses will continue to occur. So public health is the best answer. As an example of that, take, for example, the story of the invention of smallpox vaccination. Edward Jenner, Jenner, developed the first smallpox vaccination in something like 1860. Took some scrapings from a cowpox and scraped it into the skin, and it turned out those people became immune. And in fact, the smallpox vaccination was distributed widely, made available throughout the country, and spread around the world too. But even though there was a smallpox vaccination, it would take another 200 years for smallpox to be eradicated. Smallpox didn't be eradicated from the earth, from the planet, until 1980. So the illustration by that story is that just having a vaccination by itself is not the cure-all. It wasn't for smallpox, and it won't be for vaccination even for the coronavirus. You need more than a vaccination. You need public health. Public health is people doing things to protect each other in a public way. And that remains to be the mainstay of our route. So let's talk a little bit about the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a virus, of course, as part of the coronavirus series. Influenza is also a coronavirus. The Sars virus, SARS, is a coronavirus. What's interesting about this particular virus is it has spikes, as you know. And it's these spikes in its configuration which make this easily to adhere to tissues in the nose. Back to the nose again. We have, actually, this is the unfortunate part about the nose anatomy that we know about. There are cells in our nasal mucosa that actually attract coronavirus. The spikes let onto these cells and then get inhaled into your lungs. This is why the virus is so rapidly distributed. One deep breath and it's in your lungs, past your nose, and it's in your bloodstream, and then you're a very, very sick person. It's particularly vulnerable now because, as in previous pandemics, there's no specific treatment. There's no specific treatment for many of the viruses that have come along. There wasn't treatment for influenza virus. There wasn't treatment for smallpox virus. There is no treatment for coronavirus. All we can do is prevent and use public health, public health, public health, public health. Again, the pollutional particle that we know about in reference to the pollution factor is what we call PM 2.5. PM is particulate matter measuring 2.5 micron. One particle of PM 2.5 is 20 times or 25 times bigger than one molecule of coronavirus. And both all these elements are ultra light and travel easily through the air. And that's part of the problem. I would say also that the 3 million people so far in the world who have died from COVID virus, it sounds like a big number, but and it certainly is. The difference, though, is when epidemics happened in the past, the smallpox epidemics, the bubonic plague, and tuberculosis, and all those things, when there was no awareness of public health, The epidemics lasted for many, many years. We think we're in distress when we've had of this coronavirus pandemic. A year is a long time, and 3 million people is a lot of people. But the reason in the past that the epidemics went on so long is that, again, they knew nothing about public health. There was no other protective, the things they tried to do about it were the wrong things, like fumigation techniques, right? And so epidemics went on and on and on for hundreds of years. That's why whole populations were wiped out. And populations either had to escape or to stay put and die from the effects. So with that lets you just be aware of the durational factors that the rest of the people in years prior to our time have endured with and suffered with. Long time epidemics. In many cases, the epidemic stopped when the microbial organisms found no more hosts to live in. There's no more live people. The viruses by themselves cannot live on their own. Bacteria can live as long as you feed a bacteria a plate with some fuel for the bacteria. They can go on and live. But viruses cannot live unless they have a host cell to live in. So the coronavirus lasts in the air for probably a number of days after it has been coughed into the air. But if it doesn't find a host, it'll die. Shows you the absolutely dependency or the viruses that we talk about are obligate. They have an obligation to live in a human cell, which is a frightening concept just to think about it on its own. And that's a particular problem. We know, of course, lots about viruses now. There's the RNA viruses, the DNA viruses. But as it turns out, in our own situation, we still have pollution. To go back to the other P factor that we've been talking about, there are confounding factors. Pollution is in that, but there are confounding factors that make the coronavirus worse in our populations these days. The confounding factors are for people who are over 65, because their immune system is usually weaker compared to the younger people. Another confounding factor is for people who are of color, Black and of color, and Latino. They seem to have a worse time, more vulnerability for a number of reasons, probably. So that's a confounding factor. Obesity is a confounding factor that makes someone more vulnerable to the coronavirus in our population. The question comes up, why obesity? And there's a cellular explanation for that we know about. I want to bore you with cell terminology, but there's an ACE, the word's pronounced ACE, but it's a ACE, is an acronym for a type of cell which is prevalent in fat tissue. Well, coronavirus likes to invade ACE tissues. And so there's lots of ACE tissues in adipose tissue, which explains why it seems like the coronavirus prefers adipose or fat obese tissue, and why the people who are obese have suffered more severely in this thing because of their confounding problem. And of course, people with chronic lung disease and smokers in general make the coronavirus more devastating, more sickly, more fatal in many cases to those subgroups in our population. Some of that all is because of the populations I mentioned often live in areas where the pollution is worse. Urban areas, blighted areas where there's less control of emissions, less control of smoke and ventilation. Those people living in those endemic those areas of high pollution will suffer the most. If those people are African Americans, the people who are unemployed, have to live in blighted areas. They're going to suffer because of their location, and partly because of the biology of their ethnic group. It's interesting to I'm going to quote two articles that talk about the potency, the strong effect of pollution, and when it's combined with the pandemic. To our benefit now, we have lots of activity, lots of people doing biostatistics. And biostatistics have been of enormous help to us in understanding where this virus is going and how it's acting, who it's affecting, who's not affecting, what populations and so forth, what the survival rates are in that group. But the Johns Hopkins University Biostatistics program, has been very, very productive and helpful in this category, telling us about all these factors of spread and peaks and valley factors around the world too. But as you know, there was a lockdown in our country in January of this year. The lockdown pretty much brought a large reduction in traffic, in vehicular traffic over 4 or 5 months of time. Well, the Johns Hopkins people said, let's study this. What's the effect of dropping pollution, dropping emissions? When your traffic goes down, you're going to drop emissions. And so they were able to study with their monitors around. They studied the death rates in our country in 3,000 counties, representative probably of our entire population, 11 counties. And they found that a 15 or 20% drop in the emissions or the PM 2.5 counts during that period of time. As we all know, the air cleared up a lot. You could see that, you could observe that. There was a significant drop in the death rate during that time. And they have this article was published in the Harvard University Public Health Journal. And you can read it if you have. I have a reference that I can get to you if you like. But basically, it said that the mortality decreased by 4% when there's a short-term exposure decrease to PM 2.5. Again, particulate matter 2.5. So there's a measurable effect acutely right away in the number of deaths from COVID when you simply drop the pollution level a significant amount, which is reassuring to know about, and it's stimulating to think about that if we were able to control better our pollutional standards and our pollutional problems as we have them, we would effect a much better outcome, and we'd save more lives if we could fix our pollutional problems in a continuing fashion, not just for a few months, but for long term. They also demonstrated what in a smaller formula that every rise in PM 2.5 index is associated with a significant improvement in death and disease from that thing. In fact, they were able to detect that in their studies that when you put two groups in comparison, say a group has COVID and pollution, and another group who has COVID and no pollution, who die from other diseases, cardiovascular disease, stroke, trauma, and so forth, that the death rate from COVID plus pollution is 20 times higher than the death rate of COVID plus anything else. I'll say that again. So that the death rate from COVID plus pollution is the worst possible situation. It's 20 times worse that having COVID and any other disease, not, so that's a startling factor when you think of it, that COVID plus pandemic is the worst. It's worse than COVID plus, any other disease you happen to have. So it's a very, very important factor there. I want to say two other interesting studies have come out from London and from China. They studied also the number of the death and disease when between in the lockdown time from January to August. They used cell phone data to locate where people were. So a decrease of what their findings show, a decrease of 1 microgram of 2.5 toxicity is sufficient to reduce the COVID mortality by 4%. So if you just simply lower the PM 2.5 index by 1 microgram in your monitoring system, you're going to decrease a significant number of deaths by 4% in this one study from London. China found that when they dropped their emissions because of the lockdown, 25%, there was a resulting salvage of 30,000 people's lives. So again, the lockdown, which was able to produce a reduction in emissions by a lot, 25%, resulted in 30,000 people didn't die during that period of time because of that beneficial and cleaner air. So it shows you the importance of and the importance and the urgency there is for us to do something to help the pandemic situation by cleaning the air. And it's, of course, dirty air is everywhere. I would venture also to say that epidemics usually are caused by organic things, microbes, viruses, bacteria, parasites, and things like that. Malaria is a parasite. But also endemics, in my view, can be inorganic. Inorganic epidemics are bad things happens to the population of people that aren't necessarily organic, but they're things that we know are happening now in an epidemic fashion. Take, for example, opioid crisis is an epidemic. It's inorganic, it's a chemical. It causes addiction. Look how it has affected our population. When you take the pandemic and add it to a population which is also involved with opioid addiction, you find, a rise in mortality, and mortalities have been going up. And that other non-organic epidemics, I have a group of them. I talk about opioid drugs. Gun violence is an epidemic, and it figures also into the COVID situation. As people have been sick and going out of work and have financial problems, and gun violence can be coupled with that in an indirect way. It's an epidemic. We have an epidemic of hateism, which is coupled with the pandemic, makes things worse in a double way. We also have things to come to let you know about. There's an epidemic of what we call antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics over the past 100 years or so have been used excessively, we feel. And now we have an epidemic of antibiotics which, when given, are not effective. This is now becoming increasingly a problem. People get bacterial diseases, which used to be treated usually with antibiotic X, Y, or Z. Now those antibiotics give X, Y, or Z are given, and there's no effect. This is called antibiotic drug resistance. It's an epidemic now. So it's doubling our trouble with how we manage our conditions. So that my simple math figure in the beginning of this, that pandemic plus pollution is double trouble. In fact, it's much more double. It's not like 1 and 1 is 2. It's epidemic plus pollution creates multiplication factors exponentially, not only in the people who suffer illness and death, but from members of the society who suffer from other consequences of being sick and then can't get a job, can't stay in their, no longer can pay their rent, and homelessness. So those problems that stem from the epidemic, how it affects people's livelihood and people's, they may not die from it, but they sure have deadly living situation as it comes about. So that's why I'm emphasizing that we have serious troubles with the combination of this pandemic plus pollution. It comes back again, as I said before, to the idea and the reality of public health. Public health needs to be the answer, always needed to be answered. In the past, we didn't have it. Now we know much more about it. But until we can follow public health rules more exactly, yesterday's newspaper, in the Wall Street Journal, here's the headline. I'll read it. It says, virus cases trend higher amid vaccination push. There you have it. We're now, many vaccinations are occurring, but the graph shows the increase in COVID cases, even though we are now presently, 51% of adults in this country are vaccinated. The problem is people still travel. Until we have worldwide protection, vaccination, or experience with illness that in fact protects the whole world, then we won't be close to fixing this pandemic. So certainly not tomorrow, not in the year or two to come. Because if there are countries where the number of outbreaks are increasing in India, and third world countries where there's not even vaccination, had no idea about public health at all, as long as those countries show prevalence and rapid spreading and disease counts, case counts, we're all at risk. Theoretically, if you just vaccinate everybody in the United States, but not in these other countries, that doesn't do us any good. It'll take us a while to vaccinate all the people who are in our total population, youth and children. In the meantime, people will still be traveling from other countries to here, and we to there. And as long as people travel and carry with them, like the Spanish people did in their boats, once they took the smallpox virus and took it to people who were vulnerable, those stories will continue. So there is an urgency, in fact, too, that the reason why we have to get the vaccination completed is that we need to hurry the time up before the virus can mutate. Once we allow it more time to mutate, then our time slips away. There is an absolute urgency. That's the president has a good idea, but again, throughout the world, we're nowhere till worldwide elimination of the coronavirus won't occur until 80% of the world's population has either immunity by vaccination or immunity by surviving the disease. 80%. And I don't know what population of the country, of the world now has vaccination, but it's small. So we are probably not close to the time when we can relax and put down our masks and forget about public health. Our recent outbreaks in this country are occurring because there's been laxity and more sense of freedom, opening up of restaurants and things like this, whereby people are seemingly free. We have sort of a closed, selfish, you might say, attitude that so-and-so has been vaccinated, therefore you're fine. This city or this town, whatever, we can go out and have a good time. That's not the truth, because many people will carry the virus even though they don't know it. That was particularly the problem with the smallpox, because many people had the virus, the smallpox virus, and didn't know they had it. It goes chronic and it goes subclinical for a long time. The same, of course, goes for the HIV virus. It can last in someone's system for years in the dormant state before it becomes AIDS, you might say. So many people can carry the virus, HIV virus, for months and months and months and be active and spread it in ways. Of course, it's spread through sex, but also through breastfeeding. Breast milk is probably a bigger spreading factor for HIV virus than that and unclean needles. But the HIV and the smallpox both were able to be subclinical. That is, people didn't know they had the symptom, they didn't know they had the disease, and they spread it without knowing they had it. So there's that long period of time when it lasts and you don't adjust your behavior because you don't know you're sick yet. That was smallpox and HIV. Coronavirus, for what indifference, once you its tendency to cause clinical symptoms is early, with usually 3 to 5 days after someone has been exposed to it. So all these viruses act in different ways. Their contagions different, but all the viruses need a host. That's the bad news. And they see an open territory for invasion in the human being because of our nose. Our nose is out front. We have 2 portals, you might say. And it demonstrates also the absolute futility of someone wearing a mask to hear. It's like having no mask. If you want one organ covered in the coronavirus time, it'd be this, more important than the mouth, because the nose is the preferred route of entry for the coronavirus. So back to the word miasma. As I said, Mr. Galen talked about miasma meaning pollution. He meant just dirty air. We don't use the term anymore, miasma. We call it pollution, but it means the same thing. We don't call it miasma, but we still have pollution. And pollution is the problem not only to make us sick with respiratory diseases, but pollution is the problem also which has changed our climate. And there is urgency as we recognize that there's a need to change the climate situation. Our carbon now storage has reached a ceiling, a level in space, whereby the absorbing surfaces on the Earth can no longer absorb all the carbon which is being emitted. So we're beyond the curve now. There's being more carbon produced in emissions than we can absorb through trees, through forests, through ocean water, things like this. So something has to be done. There's a lot of science going on. That's on our side. We have good science, something that no previous generations have enjoyed to the effect we have. We've already done good things to help the science of pollution with non-fossil fuels and energy-saving devices. But it comes down to public health. We all have to be involved. Every person has to be a Clean Air Act themselves and do something to reduce the number of pollution elements that we all contribute to. Part of the reality of being human on the Earth at the same time with one another in gatherings as we are is that we cause pollution. It's man-made stuff. We're responsible for it. We need to fix it. And there's an urgency to it. I think our government's on the right track. This all stems back, and thanks to, I want to mention his name one more time, Gaylord Nelson, for realizing the importance of that oil spill. Look what happened to it now. International organizations, World Health Organization, the CDC, with worldwide influence, we share knowledge. That's the other thing that has to happen in this pollution/pandemic situation. We have to get the science. We have to share the science with all other countries. We have to share the numbers. We have to share the vaccine. We are now a worldwide community. So it's important that our organizations, like especially World Health and CDC and our biostatistical things and our pharmaceutical companies all share. That'll get the job done quicker. If we isolate ourselves and say, okay, we're protected, forget about the rest of the world, that's not going to work. We can't go in a silo at this time and say, we're just going to treat ourselves and protect ourselves and forget the rest of the world. Sharing, sharing, sharing. We're human beings. We share alike. We share the air. We share the water. And if we share the water and the air, then we have to do things to protect each other. So international sharing of data, science, statistics, vaccine, opinions, laws have to be enacted and shared worldwide. So my hour is up, exactly. I'm not sure how many people joined in, but for those of you who did, thank you for your attention. And stay well. There may be some questions. Do you think, Sarah?
I actually, if I may, I have two questions. I don't know, I haven't seen any questions come through on the Facebook yet. It's possible there is a bit of a delay on the Facebook video between this Zoom meeting and what's being shown on the Facebook. So it might be that people need a second or two to type in their questions. But if I may be so bold to ask a question, I know you've talked a lot about working together as a nation. And I was hoping to maybe ask you specifically, and of course I have a little bit of bias here in asking about the climate action plan that Carlisle is developing, but do you have specific ideas for how the Carlisle borough or even small municipalities, towns who might be in the same situation as Carlisle, right? Geographically, in a valley, we're at a disadvantage, but then also because of all the trucking industry, the warehouses,
Right.
are there specific steps that you'd like to see the Carlisle borough do, or even just small towns?
Well,
or
sure.
you know, what can people do to advocate for cleaner air?
Right. Well, the Clean Air Board, which I represent, has gone on record and has written up some documents that we have distributed around to different municipalities, what we call best practices. Best practices. A lot of building goes on. There's a lot of service trucks, delivery trucks, construction vehicles, and things like this. Many construction vehicles and service trucks use dirty diesel and are old trucks and things like that. So we have gone on record to advise that in the best practices for people who plan building projects and construction projects to use best practice methods to protect the air in their construction site. Hopefully to utilize better trucks, hybrid trucks, for example, and service trucks. We'd like to see also more action done to make it possible to have hybrid cars, electric cars available and used in our communities. That requires charging stations and things like this. Also, there's been strong advocacy, and even here in Carlisle, the idea of solar panels and solar energy has taken off. There's a number of developments have been built up in the last year or two that utilize solar energy completely. So I think we're talking about best practices in building projects, building housing, building new buildings, municipal buildings, and utilizing efficient vehicles. The Borough Council has formed a action committee at the borough level, and some, maybe you're on it. Some people have, it's a rather action committee, but they're meeting as a borough, as an organization, to see what you can do as on the municipality scale. Have to do mainly with trucks, vehicles, and traffic patterns and things like that. We need to make traffic flow better. And we've done that in Carlisle some years ago. We changed our main street in Carlisle from a four lane now to 3 lane, which makes traffic flow continue better, and less stalling and less that. And I should mention also that the Clean Air Board has installed 5 of these PM 2.5 monitors in our community. This measures PM 2.5 on a continual basis, day and night, 24 hours a day. And we report this data on our website. And so we like to get the data out so people have access to the data, theoretically to recognize that if on a certain day the PM 2.5 index is high, that will guide your outdoor activities better in terms of recreational things. And so monitoring, our purpose, what we're advocating for and announcing for is to do monitor. This is called a purple air monitor. And we provide the data, it's available on our website. And it's also recognizing that if we inform the public there is something you can know about, if we inform the public that PM 2.5 is toxic in high levels, then you'll do something about it, either in your group or your behaviors outside. And think what you can do less to make less toxicity. Burn your engines less, use cleaner engines, and so forth. So we're very proud of our monitoring system. Some years ago, we passed an ordinance in the state of Pennsylvania against idling. And it's hard to enforce, obviously, but the idea was the ordinance across the state says it's unhealthy to idle your truck all night. And we put signs up and things like this to make it not advisable, if possible, to idle a truck with it. Because idling engines make more emissions. If a truck or vehicle is moving through in fluid traffic, it makes less emissions. When a truck or a vehicle stops in congestion or traffic or idling, it makes more emissions. And emissions continue and collect and form worse areas. So we're proud of our monitoring. Look it up. Be aware that the monitoring is being done, and it means something. And what you can do to lower the level of toxicity is up to everybody. We all have a carbon footprint, as we know. Use less energy. Use less electricity in ways you can. Be inventive. We also have a lobby. The Climate Action Lobby, which is nationwide, goes to Washington and talks about how to handle carbon tax and things like this. So that's a separate issue, which is being worked on. Lots being done. So that's the good news, and everyone should do something, we think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I totally agree. You kind of answered my second question with that first answer. But just to make sure everyone who's watching, in case they have questions later, or in case they want to stay up to date with what the Clean Air Board is working on, the research and data that's being collected and put out into our community. Of course, I'll share the Clean Air Board's website. But do you want to give some advice for those and some resources maybe for those who might be interested in learning more and following with what the Clean Air Board is working on?
Right. The references I gave about the Harvard Public Health Study is available on our website. And the two China study, the China study, the London study also, that showed that if you can lower PM 2.5 levels, you'll save lives. Those references are, if people want scientific data, there's lots of science going on. And so that's available too. I mean, this is all backed up with science information. And it's a benefit that we have scientific studies undergoing now every day in many centers of our country and the world. So that keep your eye, and many newspapers and many news outlets are reporting on developments in this area too. So there's lots of news. Nowadays, many colleges are offering environmental majors, curriculums in their studies. And that's a huge development too, where you can go to college now, and this happening, even Dickinson has an environmental science major. So that's, we're educating about this. Education is the mainstay. If we're educated, we'll do things right. If we ignore the problem and be dumb about it, it'll make us sick, literally.
Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, Dr. Jurgensen, for your presentation, for those thoughtful answers that you just provided for us as well.
Will people be able to read this also on a recording basis at a later time from Facebook, or how does that work out? You may announce that as someone wants to hear it again or something like that.
Yeah, and we did have a little bit of an interruption in the stream. You probably didn't notice it on our end. I did repost the link. So hopefully people were able to follow along. There is a recording, of course, still going on right now. So once we wrap up, what we'll do is we'll add it to the CVR, maybe YouTube page, and then share it again to the Facebook so that the full video is available for anyone who might have been thrown off by that first technological glitch. So
Okay.
apologies for that. The full video.
Here, let me demonstrate here.
Please do.
That's a particle of particulate matter measuring 2.5 micron.
Wow.
That's what PM 2.5 looks like in one particle. Its constituents are on the outer rim, there are toxins. In the inner rim, there are metals. Sulfate is the yellow part. There are sulfates, organic compounds, and then in the center of it is elemental carbon core. All right, right there. That's the carbon. Carbon's the bad guy. It's the result of combustion, but it's also, you know, what when our cells are energized, the result of cellular energy and activity going on in our cells, two things. We produce water and CO2. We breathe out CO2 because as a result of our body metabolism, cellular metabolism. So carbon is real. It's a product of living, you might say. At the present time in our atmosphere, we have way too much of it. And decarbonation is the scientists are going to have to come up with some way to take the carbon load up there and somehow to reduce it by some scientific, but there are ways of looking at that. And some good things do come from disastrous happenings. And I'm hopeful that things like that will come about in the hopefully few years to come.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Jurgensen. We'll wrap up the event for tonight on that note. Thank you again for sharing your insight and your research and expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity, Sarah, and the rest of the CVR.